A dust-filled sunbeam cut through the cracked window of Sweetwater Junction's abandoned train depot, illuminating Ruth Harmon's tear-stained face as she clutched a telegram that had shattered her world only hours before. The year was 1878, and the promise of a new life in California had just died along with her fiancé, who'd traveled ahead to establish their homestead. Ruth's fingers trembled as she smoothed her gray traveling skirt, the small depot silent except for the occasional creak of the weathered wooden structure. Her trunk and carpet bag sat beside her on the platform bench, containing everything she owned in the world. The next train wouldn't arrive until morning, leaving her stranded in this forgotten whistle stop where the station master had locked up and departed hours ago, clearly unconcerned about the lone woman passenger. The telegram's words blurred before her eyes. Regret to inform. Benjamin Marshall. Sudden fever. Passed peacefully. Our condolences. She'd memorized every word, though each one felt like a physical blow. 3 years of correspondence, planning their future together, all ended with a piece of paper delivered by a boy who couldn't meet her eyes. The hinges of the depot door protested as it swung open, startling Ruth from her thoughts. Instinctively, she straightened her posture and wiped at her eyes, unwilling to appear vulnerable to whoever had entered. The setting sun silhouetted a tall figure in the doorway, a man wearing a wide-brimmed hat, his shoulders broad beneath a dusty duster coat. He hesitated at the threshold, clearly noting her presence. "Pardon me, madam," he said, his voice low and gravelly, as if unused to much conversation. "Didn't mean to disturb you." Ruth nodded stiffly, clutching her reticule closer. She'd heard enough cautionary tales about traveling alone to know that showing fear was unwise, but also that excessive friendliness could be misinterpreted. The stranger stepped inside, and as he moved from the backlit doorway into the dimness of the depot, his features became clearer. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. His eyes, a startling shade of blue beneath his hat brim, assessed her briefly before politely shifting away. "Train's not due until morning," he said, removing his hat and revealing dark hair in need of a trim. "Station master's gone home." "I'm aware," Ruth replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "I have nowhere else to wait." The man nodded, seeming to understand more than she'd said. He maintained a respectful distance, moving to the opposite end of the bench where she sat. "Mind if I wait too? Storm's brewing." He gestured toward the darkening sky visible through the windows. Ruth nodded her permission, though she kept her gaze fixed ahead. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds being the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional creak of the building as wind picked up outside. "Name's Kane Thornton," he finally said, not looking directly at her. "Heading east on tomorrow's train." Ruth hesitated, weighing the propriety of introducing herself to a stranger against the awkwardness of ignoring his polite overture. "Ruth Harmon," she finally offered, her Boston upbringing winning out. Kane nodded, seeming content with this small exchange. He didn't press for more conversation, which Ruth found unexpectedly considerate. Most men she'd encountered on her journey west had either ignored her completely or overwhelmed her with unwanted attention. The first heavy raindrops began to strike the depot roof, quickly building to a steady downpour. Ruth jumped slightly when a leak in the ceiling sent water dripping onto the floor not far from her feet. Without comment, Kane stood and moved a spittoon from the corner to catch the dripping water. The simple act of consideration caught Ruth off guard, and she found herself studying him more carefully. His movements were deliberate and efficient, his clothing worn but clean. A gun belt sat low on his hip, but unlike the flashy desperados she'd glimpsed in towns along her journey, his weapon seemed more a practical tool than a statement. "Thank you," she said quietly. Kane returned to his seat with a nod. "Seems this place has been forgotten. Junction's mostly dried up since the new line went through Prescott." Ruth glanced around at the dusty interior, noting the cobwebs in corners and faded schedules still tacked to the wall. I hadn't realized. My plans changed unexpectedly. The words caught in her throat, and she looked down at the telegram still clutched in her hand. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the intensifying storm outside. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the small room, followed by a crack of thunder that shook the building. Ruth flinched, and when she looked up, she found Kane watching her with quiet concern. "Bad news?" he asked, nodding toward the telegram. Ruth considered deflecting the question, but something in his straightforward manner made evasion seem unnecessary. "My fiancé died," she said simply, the words still strange to her ears. "In California. I was traveling to join him." Kane removed his hat again, holding it briefly against his chest in a gesture of respect. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Harmon." "Thank you," she whispered, surprised by how much the simple acknowledgement affected her. "I don't know what I'm going to do now." Kane didn't offer empty platitudes or unwanted advice, and Ruth found herself grateful for his silence. After a moment, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small flask. "Not much comfort to be had, but you're welcome to a sip if you like." Ruth's first instinct was to refuse. Proper ladies didn't drink spirits, particularly not from a stranger's flask, but the day's events had left her feeling hollow and numb. "Thank you," she said, accepting the flask with slight hesitation. The whiskey burned her throat, but its warmth spread through her chest, thawing something frozen inside her. She handed the flask back, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "Where are you traveling from, Mr. Thornton?" "Montana Territory," he replied, taking a small sip himself before returning the flask to his pocket. "Was working a cattle drive to Tucson. Now heading to visit my sister in Kansas." "Is that home for you?" "Montana?" Ruth asked, finding comfort in the mundane conversation. Kane's expression shifted subtly, a shadow crossing his features. "Used to be. Not anymore." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but Ruth didn't press. Everyone out west seemed to be running from something or toward something else. She'd been the latter. Now she wasn't sure which direction she faced. As night fell completely, the depot grew darker. Kane rose and lit the single oil lamp on the station master's desk, adjusting the wick to cast a warm glow throughout the small space. The storm showed no signs of abating, rain lashing against the windows while wind whistled through cracks in the weathered building. "You should try to rest," Kane suggested, returning to his seat. "I'll keep watch." Ruth wanted to argue that she wasn't tired, but the emotional exhaustion of the day weighed heavily on her. "I don't know that I can sleep," she admitted. "Then we'll just sit a while," Kane replied simply. As the hours passed, their conversation came in brief exchanges, separated by comfortable silences. Ruth learned that Kane had fought for the Union in the war, though he spoke little of those years. He'd been a cowhand, a mustanger, briefly a deputy sheriff in a mining town. In turn, she told him of her teaching position in Boston, her correspondence with Benjamin, and their plans for a small farm near Sacramento. "He sent for you after he'd established a place?" Kane asked. Ruth nodded. 3 years of letters. "He wanted everything to be perfect before I came." Her voice caught. "I never even saw the place he built for us." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the depot's windows, and Ruth drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Kane noticed her shiver and without comment removed his coat, offering it to her. "You'll be cold," she protested. "Been through worse," he said with a slight shrug. When she still hesitated, he added, "Please. My mother would haunt me if she knew I let a lady freeze." Ruth accepted the coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. It carried the scent of leather, horses, and something distinctly masculine. "Thank you," she murmured. "You're very kind, Mr. Thornton." "Kane," he corrected. "Out here, formalities don't mean much." "Kane," she repeated softly. Eventually, Despite her protests that she couldn't sleep, Ruth found her eyes growing heavy. The rhythm of the rain, the warmth of Kane's coat, and the presence of another person after days of lonely travel combined to lull her toward slumber. She tried to fight it, embarrassed at the thought of falling asleep in front of a stranger, but exhaustion won out. Kane watched as she drifted off, her head gradually tilting until it rested against the wall behind her. Carefully, he folded his spare shirt from his saddlebag to create a makeshift pillow and gently guided her to lie down on the bench. Ruth stirred briefly but didn't wake, instinctively curling into the coat that covered her. For hours, Kane kept his promise to watch over her, listening to the storm and occasionally checking the depot door when particularly strong gusts threatened to blow it open. As promised, he stayed. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through rain-washed windows. Ruth woke with a momentary confusion that quickly gave way to remembrance, both of her loss and of the kind stranger who had shared her vigil. Kane was standing by the window, watching the muddy road outside. He'd made coffee in a small tin pot heated over a pocket stove, and the rich aroma filled the small depot. "There's coffee if you'd like some," he said, turning as he heard her stir. "Trains delayed on account of washouts. Stationmaster came by to post a notice. Won't be through until tomorrow now." Ruth sat up, smoothing her rumpled skirt and hair. She felt oddly at ease despite the circumstances, the delay, the strange place, the man she barely knew. "Thank you for the coat," she said, handing it back to him. "And for watching over me." Kane accepted the coat with a nod. Seemed the right thing to do. He poured coffee into a tin cup and offered it to her. "Not as good as what you're probably used to, but it's hot." Ruth accepted the cup gratefully, cradling it in her hands. "What will you do while waiting for the train?" "There's a livery stable down the road. Thought I might see about getting some work to pass the time." "And you? Will you be all right here alone?" Ruth considered her options. The telegram said that Benjamin's body had already been buried, and she had no relations in California. The small amount of money she carried wouldn't last long. "I should find a room, I suppose. Is there an inn in this town?" "Small boarding house run by a widow named Parker. About half a mile down the main street." Kane hesitated. "If you'll allow me, I'd be happy to walk you there after you've had your coffee." The offer should have raised her guard, but Ruth found herself trusting this quiet man. "That would be very kind. Thank you." After gathering her belongings, they set out along the muddy main street of Sweetwater Junction. The storm had passed, leaving puddles that reflected the morning sky and a freshness to the air that belied the tragedy Ruth carried in her heart. Kane carried her trunk, refusing her protests with a simple, "It's no trouble." The town was smaller than Ruth had realized the previous evening, just a handful of buildings lining a single street, most in various states of disrepair. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and at the far end, a modest two-story building with a sign that read Parker House. Mrs. Parker proved to be a stern-faced woman in her 50s who scrutinized Ruth thoroughly before agreeing to rent her a room. "Don't normally take single ladies," she said, eyeing Kane suspiciously. "Too much potential for trouble. Miss Harmon is recently bereaved," Kane explained quietly. "Her fiancé passed in California. She's waiting for the train to resume service." Something in Mrs. Parker's expression softened slightly. "Lost my husband in '65, she said. "Virginia. I understand being stranded." She turned to Ruth. "Room's $1 a night, includes breakfast and supper. No gentlemen callers in the rooms, no exceptions." "Thank you," Ruth said, relieved to have secured lodging. She turned to Kane, suddenly uncertain. "And thank you for your assistance, Mr. Thornton." Kane replaced his hat, which he'd removed upon entering the boarding house. "My pleasure, Miss Harmon. I wish you safe travels when the train arrives." He nodded to Mrs. Parker and turned to leave. Ruth watched him go, a strange reluctance filling her. This man had been nothing but kind to her during one of the darkest moments of her life, expecting nothing in return. "Mr. Thornton," she called impulsively. When he turned back, she said, "Perhaps I could buy you supper this evening, to thank you properly for your kindness." A ghost of a smile touched Kane's lips. "No need for thanks, but I wouldn't turn down the company." He tipped his hat slightly. "I'll call for you at 6, if that's acceptable?" Ruth nodded, ignoring Mrs. Parker's raised eyebrows. 6 would be fine. After Kane departed, Mrs. Parker showed Ruth to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Been a long while since we had strangers in town," she commented as Ruth set down her carpet bag. "Especially ones who look like they've stepped out of different worlds." Ruth glanced at her, unsure how to respond. Mrs. Parker studied her with shrewd eyes. "He's not your usual sort, I'd wager." "We only met yesterday," Ruth explained, "when I was stranded at the depot." Mrs. Parker nodded. "Kane Thornton's got a reputation in these parts." "Not a bad one," she added quickly, seeing Ruth's expression. "Just known for keeping to himself, doing his job without fuss. Works cattle drives most years. Good with horses. Better with a gun, though he doesn't make a show of it." "You know him?" Ruth asked, surprised. "Sweetwater might be dying, but news still travels. He's passed through before." Mrs. Parker moved toward the door. "Rest if you need to. Washrooms down the hall. Supper's at 6:30 for boarders, but I suppose you'll be dining elsewhere tonight." Left alone, Ruth unpacked her few belongings and washed away the travel grime as best she could with the basin of water Mrs. Parker had provided. Her black morning dress was wrinkled from being packed, but it was the most appropriate garment she possessed under the circumstances. As she changed, Ruth wondered what had possessed her to invite Kane to dinner. Perhaps it was simply gratitude, or the need for companionship in her grief. Whatever the reason, she found herself looking forward to the evening with unexpected anticipation. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock came at the boarding house door. Ruth descended the stairs to find Kane waiting in the small parlor, hat in hand. He'd clearly made an effort to clean up. His hair was damp and combed, his shirt fresh, though his coat still bore the signs of hard travel. "You look nice," he said simply, his eyes taking in her black dress with something like concern. "Are you sure you're up for going out?" The question touched Ruth. "I think I need to," she admitted. "Sitting alone with my thoughts hasn't been helpful today." Kane nodded in understanding. "There's only one place in town that serves food, the saloon. But they keep a separate dining room for ladies. If that's not suitable, Mrs. Parker might." "The saloon will be fine," Ruth assured him, touched by his consideration. In Boston, she would never have entered such an establishment, but this was the West, and different rules applied. They walked side by side down the muddy street as the setting sun painted the scattered clouds in brilliant orange and pink. Ruth was acutely aware of Kane beside her, his measured stride adjusted to match hers, the way he positioned himself between her and the occasional passing rider. The saloon was named simply the Watering Hole, its weathered sign creaking slightly in the evening breeze. Kane held the door for her, and Ruth entered a surprisingly clean establishment with a handful of tables separated from the main bar by a wooden partition. A middle-aged woman with elaborately styled hair approached them immediately. "Well, Mr. Thornton, didn't expect to see you back in Sweetwater so soon," she said warmly before turning curious eyes to Ruth. "And with a lady friend, no less." "Evening, Flora," Kane replied. "This is Miss Ruth Harmon. She's stranded until the train comes through. Miss Harmon, this is Flora Jenkins. She runs the cleanest establishment between Tucson and Prescott." Flora beamed at the compliment. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Harmon. Any friend of Kane's is welcome here. Let me show you to a table." As they settled at a corner table covered with a checkered cloth, Ruth felt several curious glances from the few other patrons. "I believe we're causing quite a stir," she murmured to Kane. A hint of amusement crossed his face. "New faces are rare enough." A proper lady like yourself is rarer still. Flora brought them plates of beef stew with biscuits and corn, along with glasses of surprisingly good wine. On the house, she insisted when Ruth tried to pay. Any woman brave enough to be seen with the notorious Kane Thornton deserves a free meal. Ruth raised her eyebrows at Kane after Flora departed. Notorious? Kane looked faintly embarrassed. Flora exaggerates. I helped her out of a difficult situation once. She's never let me forget it. What kind of situation? Ruth asked, genuinely curious about this man who revealed so little about himself. Kane seemed to weigh his words carefully. Her previous business partner had ideas about how a lady should be treated. I disagreed with his methods. Ruth suspected there was much more to the story, but didn't press. Instead, she asked about his sister in Kansas, and Kane spoke warmly of Rebecca, widowed during the war and now raising 3 children alone on a small farm. She's the strongest person I know, he said, his admiration evident. Lost everything but those kids, and never once stopped fighting. You visit her often? Ruth asked, finding his devotion to family endearing. Not as often as I should, Kane admitted. Been sending money when I can. This visit's special, though. Her oldest boy is turning 16. As they ate, their conversation flowed more easily than Ruth would have expected. Kane spoke little of himself, but asked thoughtful questions about her life in Boston, her teaching career, her journey west. There was a genuine interest in his questions that made Ruth feel truly seen in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. Benjamin and I never actually met in person, she confessed after her second glass of wine loosened her tongue. 3 years of letters, planning our future, but we never stood face to face. Is that not the strangest thing? To mourn someone you never truly knew. Kane considered her words seriously. Grief's a personal thing. No right or wrong way to feel it. I'm not sure what I'm mourning more, the man or the future he represented, Ruth said softly, the realization dawning on her as she spoke. Is that terrible of me? It's honest, Kane replied. And honesty's never terrible. As the evening progressed, the saloon grew more crowded and louder. Kane noticed Ruth's increasing discomfort with the raucous atmosphere and suggested they leave. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, stars brilliant overhead in a way Ruth had never seen in Boston. Would you like to walk a bit? Kane asked. Might help clear your head before sleep. Ruth nodded, and they strolled slowly through the quiet town. Most buildings were dark now, only the saloon and a few residences showing lamplight through windows. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country. It's beautiful, Ruth said, gazing at the vast landscape silvered by moonlight. I've never seen so much space before. That's what caught me when I first came west, Kane admitted. The endlessness of it. Ruth wrapped her shawl tighter against the evening chill. What will you do after visiting your sister? Kane was quiet for a moment. Not sure. Been drifting a while now. Might be time to put down roots somewhere. Where would you choose? Ruth asked, curious about what would appeal to this wandering man. Somewhere with good water and decent soil. Room for horses. He glanced at her. What about you? What happens after tomorrow's train? The question brought Ruth back to her uncertain reality. I suppose I'll return east. There's nothing for me in California now. Is there something waiting for you in Boston? Kane asked, his voice gentle. Ruth considered the question honestly. A position teaching, perhaps, if my replacement hasn't been hired permanently. My parents are gone. I have a cousin in New York, but we're not close. She sighed. I sold or gave away most of my possessions before leaving. I was so certain of my future. Kane nodded in understanding. Life has a way of changing paths when we least expect it. They had reached the depot, where they'd met the previous night. In the moonlight, it looked even more abandoned and forlorn. Ruth paused, looking at the building that had witnessed the beginning of her new uncertainty. Would you like to sit a while? Kane asked, gesturing to the depot's small porch. Ruth nodded, and they settled on the steps, looking out at the silvered landscape. A coyote called in the distance, its lonely howl echoing across the open country. I never thanked you properly, Ruth said after a moment. For staying with me last night. You didn't have to do that. Kane looked at her directly, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. Some things you do because they're right, not because you have to. The simple statement touched something deep within Ruth. In a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and frightening, Kane's straightforward decency was like a beacon. Impulsively, she reached out and placed her hand on his. I'm glad you were the one who walked into that depot, she said softly. Kane turned his hand to hold hers gently. So am I, he replied, his voice equally soft. For a long moment, they sat in silence, their joined hands a small point of warmth in the cool night. Ruth knew she should pull away. It wasn't proper. She barely knew this man, but she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. Finally, Kane spoke. It's getting late. I should see you back to Mrs. Parker's. The walk back to the boarding house seemed too short. At the door, Ruth turned to face Kane, suddenly reluctant for the evening to end. Will I see you tomorrow, before the train? If you'd like, he replied. I'll be at the livery until noon, then I'll collect my things from the hotel. I would like that, Ruth said, surprising herself with her honesty. Perhaps we could share lunch before departure? Kane smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his features. I'd like that very much, Miss Harmon. Ruth, she corrected him. If I'm to call you Kane, then you must call me Ruth. Ruth, he repeated, the name sounding different in his low voice. Sleep well. She watched him walk away before entering the boarding house, where Mrs. Parker sat in the parlor with her knitting, clearly waiting up. The older woman gave Ruth a knowing look, but said nothing as Ruth bid her good night and climbed the stairs to her room. Alone again, Ruth prepared for bed, her mind full of confusing thoughts. She'd lost her fiancé just yesterday, yet here she was, feeling drawn to another man. Was it simply her vulnerability making her seek connection, or was there something genuine in her attraction to Kane? And what did it matter anyway? Tomorrow they would board a train and go their separate ways, he to Kansas and she back east. Still, as she drifted toward sleep, it was Kane's steady presence rather than Benjamin's memory that filled her thoughts. Morning arrived with clear skies and the news that the train would indeed arrive that afternoon. Ruth packed her few belongings and paid Mrs. Parker for her night's lodging before setting out to find Kane at the livery stable. She found him in the corral behind the stable, working with a spirited bay gelding that seemed determined to resist the saddle. Ruth watched from the fence as Kane spoke soothingly to the animal, his movements calm and deliberate. The horse gradually settled under his patient handling. You have a gift, Ruth called when Kane had successfully saddled the horse. He looked up, a smile spreading across his face when he saw her. Just patience, he replied, leading the horse toward her. Some creatures need time to accept new circumstances. Some people too, Ruth said softly. Kane tied the horse to the fence rail and wiped his hands on a cloth. How are you feeling today? Better than yesterday, Ruth admitted. Clearer somehow. Kane studied her face. That's good to hear. Have you had breakfast? Ruth nodded. Mrs. Parker insisted, though I had little appetite. But I am looking forward to our lunch before the train. Let me finish with this fellow, and I'm all yours, Kane said, then colored slightly at his choice of words. That is, I'll be ready to join you. Ruth felt her own cheeks warm at the slip. I'll wait, she said, settling on a bench near the corral. Watching Kane work, Ruth was struck by the fluid economy of his movements. Everything he did had a purpose, nothing wasted or showy. The horse responded to his quiet confidence, gradually accepting his guidance without fear. Where did you learn to handle horses like that? Ruth asked when Kane had finished his task and joined her. My father raised horses in Kentucky before the war, he replied, wiping sweat from his brow. Taught me that force never works as well as understanding. A wise man, Ruth commented. In some ways, Kane acknowledged. Lost everything during the war. Couldn't adapt to the changes afterward. Drank himself to death while I was fighting up in Tennessee. The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, made Ruth's heart ache. I'm sorry. Kane shrugged slightly. Long time ago now. He gestured toward the main street. Shall we find something to eat? They chose a small table outside the general store, where the proprietor's wife served simple sandwiches and coffee. The day had grown warm, the spring sun bringing out wildflowers in the open country surrounding the small town. Have you decided what you'll do? Kane asked as they ate. After you return east? Ruth sighed. Not entirely. I have enough money for the journey and perhaps a month's lodging while I look for a teaching position. Beyond that. She trailed off, the uncertainty of her future still daunting. Kane was quiet for a moment, seemingly weighing something in his mind. Finally, he said, I have a proposition if you're willing to hear it. Ruth raised her eyebrows in surprise. A proposition. Not the kind you're thinking, Kane assured her hastily. Nothing improper. It's just he hesitated. My sister's been writing to me about needing a teacher for her children and others nearby. The town school closed after most folks moved on following a drought. She's been teaching them herself, but with the farm and everything else, it's too much. Ruth set down her coffee cup, her interest piqued. You're suggesting I consider a position in Kansas? Kane nodded. It wouldn't be what you're used to. Small farm community, children of different ages all together. The pay wouldn't match a Boston school, but living costs less, and Rebecca would provide room and board. You're serious, Ruth said, studying his face. Completely. Kane met her gaze steadily. It would solve Rebecca's problem, provide you with immediate employment, and... He paused. And I'd have a chance to know you better if that's something you might want. The directness of his statement took Ruth's breath away. We've known each other for less than 2 days, she said softly. I know, Kane acknowledged. And you're still grieving. I'm not asking for promises or commitments. Just a chance. For both of us. Ruth looked down at her plate, her mind racing. Kane's suggestion was entirely impractical, possibly scandalous, and yet it offered a direction when she had none, a purpose when she felt adrift. And there was something about Kane Thornton that made her feel safe and valued in a way she couldn't quite explain. I would need to consider it carefully, she said finally, looking up to meet his eyes. This isn't a decision to make lightly. Kane nodded, no disappointment visible in his expression. Of course. You have until New Briar Creek to decide. That's where I changed trains for Kansas. How long until we reach New Briar Creek? Ruth asked. 3 days, Kane replied. Time enough to think, I hope. The distant sound of a train whistle interrupted their conversation. Kane checked his pocket watch. Earlier than expected. We should collect our things. They hurried back to their respective lodgings to gather their luggage. Ruth found herself moving with nervous energy, her mind still processing Kane's unexpected proposal. By the time she reached the depot, the train was pulling in, steam billowing around the platform. Kane was already there, his saddlebags and bedroll beside him. He stepped forward to take Ruth's trunk. Let me help you with that. As passengers disembarked and others prepared to board, Ruth and Kane stood slightly apart from the crowd. Are you certain about this offer? Ruth asked quietly. You barely know me. Kane's expression was serious. I know enough to recognize a good person when I meet one. The rest we can learn along the way. The conductor called for boarding, and Kane helped Ruth onto the train, finding them seats together in a car that was only half full. As the train pulled away from Sweetwater Junction, Ruth watched the small town recede through the window, feeling as though she was leaving more than just a place behind. 3 days, Kane said quietly beside her. No pressure for an answer before then. Ruth nodded, turning from the window to look at him. Tell me more about your sister and her farm. As the train rumbled eastward, Kane described the small community near Lawrence, Kansas, where his sister had rebuilt her life after the war. He spoke of the rich soil, the tight-knit neighbors who helped each other through hard times, the simple but decent school building that now stood empty. The children deserve better than sporadic lessons between farm chores, Kane explained. Rebecca does her best, but she's not trained as you are. How many children? Ruth asked, professional interest mixing with her personal considerations. About 12 of school age within traveling distance. Rebecca's 3, plus neighboring farms. Ages from 6 to 16. Ruth nodded, her mind already organizing potential lesson plans and arrangements. Teaching had always been her passion, and the challenge of a one-room school with multiple age groups appealed to her educational instincts. The day passed in conversation interspersed with comfortable silences as the landscape changed outside their window. When evening fell, the train stopped at a larger town where passengers could disembark for dinner at a station restaurant. Kane escorted Ruth to a table, conscious of the curious glances they received. A young woman traveling with a man who was clearly not her husband drew attention, particularly when that man wore the unmistakable attire of a working cowboy. People are staring, Ruth murmured as they waited for their food. Let them, Kane replied simply. We know the truth of our arrangement. Ruth smiled at his unconcern. And what is that truth exactly? Kane considered the question seriously. That I'm escorting a lady to consider a teaching position near my sister's home, and that I have nothing but respect for her. Nothing but respect? Ruth asked, surprising herself with the teasing tone in her voice. A flush crept up Kane's neck. Well, perhaps a bit more than just respect, he admitted quietly. But nothing that would dishonor you. Ruth felt her own cheeks warm at his candor. Thank you for your honesty. It's refreshing. After dinner, they returned to the train, which would travel through the night. As darkness fell outside the windows, the car grew quiet, most passengers attempting to sleep in their seats. Ruth found herself growing drowsy, lulled by the rhythmic clicking of the wheels on the track. You can lean on me if it helps, Kane offered, noting her unsuccessful attempts to find a comfortable position. Ruth hesitated, aware of the impropriety, but exhaustion won out. She leaned cautiously against Kane's shoulder, which proved to be as solid and comfortable as it looked. Thank you, she murmured. Rest, Kane replied softly. I'll wake you if we need to change trains. Ruth drifted into sleep, feeling oddly secure despite the uncertainty of her situation. She dreamed of open prairies and a small farmhouse, of children's voices and Kane's smile in the morning sunlight. She woke briefly in the night to find that Kane had draped his coat over her like a blanket and was himself dozing with his head against the window. In the dim light of the oil lamps that burned low in the car, his features looked younger, the lines of care softened by sleep. Ruth studied him for a moment before closing her eyes again, a strange feeling of contentment warming her despite her circumstances. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern: hours of conversation or companionable silence on the train, stops for meals or to change trains, and nights spent dozing in their seats. Ruth learned more about Kane's life, his time in the war, his years working cattle drives across the territories, his dream of someday having his own horse ranch. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Boston, her decision to become a teacher despite her family's preference that she simply marry well, and her correspondence with Benjamin that had led to her journey west. He seemed perfect in his letters, Ruth confessed as they shared a simple lunch at a station stop. So thoughtful, so articulate about his hopes and plans. I wonder now if I fell in love with the idea of him rather than the man himself. Kane nodded in understanding. Easy to present only your best self on paper. Yes, Ruth agreed. Though I don't think he was being deliberately deceptive. We both probably showed only the parts we thought would please the other. And now? Kane asked, his gaze direct. What parts of yourself are you showing me? The question caught Ruth by surprise. I don't know, she admitted. These past days have been so strange, so outside my normal experience. I'm not sure I know which parts are real anymore. Kane reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. From what I've seen, all the parts are worth knowing. The simple statement warmed Ruth more than she cared to admit. As they reboard the train, she found herself watching Kane the way he naturally helped an elderly woman with her bags, how he tipped his hat respectfully to the conductor, his easy conversation with a young boy fascinated by his gun belt. Everything about him spoke of a natural integrity that had nothing to do with formal education or social position. By the evening of the third day, Ruth knew she had made her decision. They were due to arrive in New Briar Creek shortly after dinner, where Kane would change trains for Lawrence while the main line continued east. I've been thinking about your sister's teaching position, Ruth said as they finished a simple meal in the dining car. Kane looked up, his expression carefully neutral. And I would like to accept on a trial basis, Ruth said, her voice steadier than she expected. Perhaps for the remainder of the school term. That would give both your sister and me time to determine if the arrangement is suitable. Kane's face broke into a smile that transformed his features. She'll be pleased to hear it. The children too. And you? Ruth asked softly. Are you pleased? Kane's eyes held hers. More than I can properly express in a public dining car. Ruth felt heat rise to her cheeks. We should agree on some terms, she said, trying to maintain a practical approach to what was, after all, a professional decision. About my duties, compensation, living arrangements. Of course, Kane agreed readily. Rebecca handles the school committee's funds. She'll want to discuss those details with you directly. As for living arrangements, there's a small bedroom off the kitchen in her house. Private entrance, if that's important to you. And what about? Ruth hesitated, unsure how to frame her question. Us. Kane supplied. When she nodded, he continued, I don't stay at Rebecca's farm. Have a room in town when I'm there. We'd see each other as much or as little as you're comfortable with. His consideration touched Ruth deeply. Thank you for understanding that I need time. Some things shouldn't be rushed, Kane said simply. When the train pulled into New Briar Creek Station that evening, Kane helped Ruth with her trunk and escorted her to the hotel where they would stay overnight before catching the local train to Lawrence in the morning. 2 rooms, Kane specified clearly to the clerk. The lady will require your best accommodation. The clerk, a young man with spectacles, glanced between them with barely concealed curiosity before assigning them rooms at opposite ends of the hallway. Kane carried Ruth's trunk to her door, setting it down carefully. Will you be all right? He asked. If you need anything during the night, I'm in room 12. I'll be fine, Ruth assured him. Thank you for everything, Kane. He tipped his hat slightly. My pleasure, Ruth. Sleep well. Alone in her room, Ruth sat on the edge of the bed, still somewhat stunned by the turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been traveling to California to marry a man she knew only through letters. Now she was in a small Kansas town, about to take a teaching position near the farm of a woman she'd never met, all because of a chance encounter with a cowboy in an abandoned depot. If her Boston friends could see her now, they would be scandalized. Yet Ruth felt more alive, more present in her own life than she had in years. There was something liberating about having lost everything she had planned for it left her free to create something new. The following morning, Kane knocked on her door promptly at 7. Train leaves at 8, he said when she opened the door. Thought you might like breakfast first. They ate in the hotel's small dining room, Kane unusually quiet as he worked through his plate of eggs and ham. Ruth sensed his nervousness and found it endearing. Second thoughts? She asked gently. Kane looked up, surprised. About you coming to Lawrence? Not at all. Just hoping Rebecca's place lives up to what I've described. and that you won't find the town too provincial after Boston. I'm not expecting Boston, Ruth assured him. I'm expecting something new, and I'm looking forward to it. Kane's relief was visible. Good. That's good. The local train to Lawrence was smaller and less comfortable than the main line they'd been traveling, but the journey was only a few hours. As they approached the town, Kane pointed out landmarks through the window: the river that provided water for the surrounding farms, the church steeple visible from miles away, the rolling hills that turned brilliant green in spring. It's beautiful, Ruth said sincerely, admiring the landscape. Different from what I'm used to, but beautiful in its own way. Lawrence itself proved to be larger than Ruth had expected, with a proper main street lined with brick buildings, several churches, and even a small college on a hill overlooking the town. Kane helped her down from the train, handling her trunk with practiced ease. Rebecca said she'd meet us at the station, he explained, scanning the small crowd on the platform. There she is. Ruth followed his gaze to see a slender woman in a practical blue dress, waving energetically. As she approached, Ruth could see the family resemblance: the same striking blue eyes, though Rebecca's hair was several shades lighter than her brother's. Kane, Rebecca called, embracing her brother warmly before turning curious eyes to Ruth. And you must be Miss Harmon. Kane's telegram was frustratingly short on details. Ruth, please, Ruth replied, extending her hand. Your brother has told me much about you and your children. Rebecca took her hand with a warm smile. All good things, I hope. I've borrowed Mr. Peterson's wagon to take us out to the farm. It's about 4 miles from town. As they loaded Ruth's trunk into the wagon, Rebecca kept up a steady stream of conversation, filling them in on local news and peppering Ruth with questions about her teaching experience. By the time they set off toward the farm, Ruth felt as though she'd known the woman for years rather than minutes. The children are beside themselves with excitement, Rebecca explained as she expertly guided the team of horses. I've had them cleaning the schoolhouse all week. It's small, but sound. Built just 3 years ago before people started leaving. How many families remain in the area? Ruth asked. For within easy walking distance of a school, plus 2 more about a mile out, Rebecca replied. Mostly small farmers. Good people, though life's been hard since the drought 2 years back. The countryside was indeed beautiful, with gently rolling hills covered in spring grass and wildflowers. Occasional groves of trees broke the open landscape, and in the distance, Ruth could see what appeared to be a small cluster of buildings. That's our place, Kane said, following her gaze. Not much to look at, but the land's good. As they drew closer, Ruth could make out a modest farmhouse with a wide porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, and about 100 yards away, a smaller structure that she guessed was the schoolhouse. Fields stretched behind the buildings, some already showing the green of early crops. It's lovely, Ruth said sincerely. Rebecca shot her brother a pleased look. We've worked hard to make it so. My husband started with raw land before the war. Afterward, I couldn't bear to leave, even when others did. They pulled up in front of the farmhouse, where 3 children of varying ages stood waiting on the porch. The oldest, a boy of about 15 who strongly resembled Kane, stepped forward to help with the horses. That's James, Kane said proudly. Growing like a weed since I saw him last. The other 2 children, a girl of about 12 and a boy who looked to be around 8, hung back slightly, eyeing Ruth with undisguised curiosity. Sarah and William, Rebecca introduced them. Children, this is Miss Harmon. She's going to be your teacher. And staying with us? Sarah asked, her eyes wide. Yes, Rebecca confirmed. In the summer room, off the kitchen. So I expect you all to be on your best behavior. Kane helped Ruth down from the wagon, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. Welcome to the Thornton farm, he said softly, for her ears alone. The children helped carry Ruth's belongings into the house, which proved to be simple but comfortable inside. The promised room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a small table with a wash basin, and a window that overlooked a kitchen garden. "It's not what you're used to, I'm sure," Rebecca said, hovering in the doorway. "But we've tried to make it comfortable." "It's perfect," Ruth assured her. "Much nicer than I expected." After settling in and sharing a simple but delicious meal with the family, Kane suggested showing Ruth the schoolhouse before darkness fell. They walked the short distance together, the setting sun casting long shadows across the field that separated the school from the farmhouse. The schoolhouse was a single room with windows on 3 sides, a pot-bellied stove in one corner, and rows of simple desks facing a teacher's desk on a small raised platform. A blackboard covered most of one wall, and bookshelves, sadly understocked, lined another. "The committee has a small fund for books and supplies," Kane explained as Ruth explored the room. "Not much, but Rebecca says they're willing to spend it now that they have a proper teacher." Ruth ran her hand along the teacher's desk, her mind already cataloging what she would need. "It's a good space. Plenty of light, room for all the children you mentioned." Kane watched her, a small smile playing at his lips. "You're already planning lessons, aren't you?" Ruth looked up, returning his smile. "Is it that obvious?" "You get a particular look in your eyes," he said. "Focused. Determined. I noticed it on the train, when you were reading." The observation surprised Ruth that he had been watching her closely enough to notice such a thing. "When do they expect classes to begin?" "Monday," Kane replied. "Gives you the weekend to prepare. Meet some of the families." Ruth nodded, moving to examine the books on the shelves, mostly well-worn readers, a few arithmetic texts, a Bible, and, surprisingly, a relatively recent atlas. "This is a good start." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the last rays of sunlight streaming through the western windows. Finally, Kane spoke. "Are you having second thoughts?" Ruth turned to face him fully. "No," she said honestly. "It feels right being here. Which is strange, considering how I came to be here." Kane took a step closer to her. "Sometimes the best paths are the ones we never plan to take." "Is that wisdom from your years as a cowboy?" Ruth asked, a teasing note in her voice. "Just something I've observed," Kane replied, his eyes holding hers. "The happiest people I've known weren't the ones who stuck rigidly to a plan." Ruth nodded, thinking of her carefully constructed future that had dissolved with a single telegram. "I'm beginning to understand that." Kane reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. "I'm glad you're here, Ruth," he said simply. "Whatever comes of it." Ruth looked down at their joined hands, her pale, city-soft fingers entwined with his sun-darkened, work-hardened ones. Such different lives they had led, yet here they were, standing together in a small schoolhouse on the Kansas prairie. "So am I," she replied softly. The weekend passed in a flurry of activity as Ruth prepared for her first day of teaching. Rebecca introduced her to the neighboring families, all of whom welcomed her with cautious optimism. Kane helped repair some broken desks in the schoolhouse and mounted a new American flag on the pole outside. By Sunday evening, Ruth felt as prepared as she could be, with lesson plans organized for the different age groups and a schedule that would allow her to divide her attention appropriately. Rebecca had provided her with information about each child's previous education, which varied considerably. After the children were in bed, the 3 adults sat on the farmhouse porch, enjoying the cool evening air. Kane had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout dinner, and Ruth wondered what was on his mind. "Will you stay for the first day of school?" Ruth asked him, breaking a comfortable silence. Kane looked up from the piece of wood he'd been whittling. "I'd like to, if you don't mind. Need to head back north soon, though. Got a job waiting in Nebraska." Ruth felt a surprising pang of disappointment. Though she had known his visit to his sister's farm was temporary, she had grown accustomed to his steady presence. "How long will you be gone?" "Cattle drive to Cheyenne," Kane explained. 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. Rebecca gave her brother a knowing look. Shortest one you've taken in years. Kane shot his sister a warning glance that made Ruth wonder what she was missing. Promised I'd be back for James's birthday in July, he said. Of course, Ruth said, trying to sound casual. We'll look forward to hearing about your adventures when you return. Later, as Ruth prepared for bed in her small room, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Kane standing outside, his hat in his hands. I'm sorry for the late hour, he said quietly, but I wanted to speak with you privately before tomorrow. Ruth stepped outside, pulling her shawl around her shoulders against the cool night air. Is something wrong?
Kane shook his head.
No, nothing's wrong. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I want you to know that you're not obligated to anything because of our arrangement. If after I'm gone, you decide this place isn't for you, or if you meet someone else, Kane, Ruth interrupted gently. What's brought this on? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I realized today, watching you with Rebecca and the children, how quickly you fit in here. And I wondered if I'd been selfish, encouraging you to come. Ruth studied his face in the moonlight. Do you regret it? No, he said immediately. Not for a moment. But I want you to have choices, Ruth. Real ones, not just following a path because it seemed the only option at the time. The consideration behind his words touched Ruth deeply. I made my choice freely, she assured him. And while I can't predict the future, I'm glad to be here now. Kane nodded, seeming relieved.
Good.
That's good. He hesitated, then added, All right, while I'm away. If that's all right. I'd like that very much, Ruth replied, a smile forming despite her best efforts to remain composed. They stood for a moment in the silvery moonlight, neither quite ready to say goodnight. Finally, Kane took a small step closer. Ruth, he said softly, may I kiss you goodnight? The request, so properly asked, made Ruth's heart beat faster. She nodded, words suddenly beyond her. Kane leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief and tender, a promise rather than a demand, but it left Ruth breathless nonetheless. Good night, Ruth, Kane whispered as he pulled away. Sleep well. Good night, Kane, she managed to reply, her voice steadier than she expected. As she watched him walk back toward the barn where he was sleeping during his visit, Ruth touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. So much had changed in a week. She had lost one future and found the possibility of another, one she had never imagined but now couldn't stop thinking about. Morning arrived clear and bright, the perfect day for beginning a new school term. Ruth dressed carefully in her most professional attire, a navy skirt and white shirtwaist that had been packed for her new life in California, but now would serve her in Kansas. Breakfast was a lively affair, the children bubbling with excitement about school resuming. James, as the oldest, tried to maintain a dignified interest, but even he couldn't hide his curiosity about what Miss Harmon would teach them. Kane was quiet during the meal, but Ruth caught him watching her several times, a mixture of pride and something more personal in his gaze. When it was time to leave for the schoolhouse, he offered to accompany her and carry her books and teaching materials. Nervous? He asked as they walked across the field, the children running ahead. A little, Ruth admitted. First days are always challenging, even in established schools. Here, I'm not sure what to expect. You'll do fine, Kane assured her. Those children already admire you, and they haven't even had their first lesson. Ruth smiled gratefully. Thank you for your confidence. By the time they reached the schoolhouse, other children had begun to arrive, some walking alone, others accompanied by parents curious about the new teacher. Ruth greeted each one warmly, making mental notes of names and ages to match with the information Rebecca had provided. Altogether, there were 11 children ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. Ruth organized them by approximate grade level, assigning seats and explaining how the day would proceed. The parents gradually departed, leaving Kane leaning against the back wall, an encouraging smile on his face. As Ruth began her first lesson, she felt the familiar rhythm of teaching return. Despite the wide range of ages and abilities, the children were attentive and eager to learn. By mid-morning, when she called for a brief recess, Ruth felt a growing confidence that this unusual arrangement might work after all. Kane slipped out during recess, returning with a small bouquet of wildflowers that he placed on her desk with a wink before resuming his position at the back of the room. The simple gesture warmed Ruth's heart and brought a flush to her cheeks that didn't escape the notice of the older girls, who exchanged knowing glances. When the school day ended, the children departed with assignments in hand and a visible enthusiasm that Ruth found deeply satisfying. Kane remained behind, helping her organize materials for the next day. "They adore you already," he observed as he straightened desks. "Even James, and he's at the age where nothing impresses him." Ruth smiled, tidying her notes. "They're good children, eager to learn." "Rebecca says the parents are already talking about keeping the school open through the summer if you're willing. Usually they close for planting and harvest." "I'd be happy to consider it," Ruth replied, "though I understand farm work takes priority." Kane nodded, moving to stand near her desk. "I have to leave tomorrow," he said, his tone regretful. "The job won't wait." Ruth looked up at him, surprised by the strength of her disappointment. "So soon?" "Afraid so. Already delayed longer than I should have." He hesitated, then added, "But I'll be back for James's birthday, as I promised." "July seems very far away," Ruth said softly. Kane reached out to touch her hand where it rested on the desk. "It does," he agreed. "But all right. And when I return—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "When I return, I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing." Ruth felt her heart quicken at the formal request. "I'd like that," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Kane's face brightened with a smile that transformed his features. "Then I have something to look forward to during those long nights on the trail." That evening, their last together before Kane's departure, was bittersweet. The family shared a special dinner, with Rebecca making Kane's favorite foods and the children eager to tell him about their first day with their new teacher. Throughout the meal, Ruth was acutely aware of Kane's presence beside her, their shoulders occasionally brushing in the crowded space around the table. After the children were in bed, Kane asked Ruth to walk with him one last time to the schoolhouse. In the quiet spring evening, with stars beginning to appear overhead, they strolled slowly across the field, neither in a hurry to reach their destination. "I've been thinking," Kane said as they walked, "about what comes next." "Your cattle drive?" Ruth asked. "After that," Kane clarified. "I've been saving these past few years. Almost enough for a small place of my own." Ruth glanced at him, curious. "Your horse ranch?" Kane nodded. "There's land available not far from here. Good water, plenty of grazing. Rebecca's been keeping an eye on it for me." "It sounds perfect for what you want," Ruth said sincerely. Kane stopped walking, turning to face her in the gathering dusk. "What I want has changed, Ruth. Or rather, expanded." He took her hands in his. "I still want the ranch, but I've realized I don't want it alone." Ruth's breath caught as the implication of his words became clear. "Kane, I'm not asking for an answer now," he said quickly. "It's too soon, I know that. But I wanted you to understand why I'm coming back. Not just for James's birthday or to visit Rebecca. I'm coming back for you if you'll have me." Ruth looked up at this man who had walked into her life so unexpectedly just over a week ago. A man who had shown her nothing but respect, consideration, and growing affection. A man whose kiss she could still feel on her lips. "I'll be here," she said simply. "And I'll have an answer for you then." Kane's smile was brilliant even in the dim light. He leaned down to kiss her again, this time with more assurance, but still with gentle respect. Ruth responded, allowing herself to express the feelings that had been growing since that first night in the abandoned depot. When they finally parted, Kane kept her hands in his. "I should get you back to the house before Rebecca sends out a search party." Ruth laughed softly. "She does seem to have a keen interest in our friendship. She's been trying to see me settled for years," Kane admitted with a rueful smile. "Never thought it would happen quite like this." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, hands still linked, Ruth marveled at the turn her life had taken. From the depths of grief and uncertainty to the beginning of something new and hopeful, all because a cowboy had taken a seat beside her in an abandoned depot and stayed. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect spring day that seemed to mock Ruth's melancholy mood. Kane was packed and ready to leave by sunrise, his horse saddled and waiting by the farmhouse gate. The family gathered to say their goodbyes, Rebecca with admonitions to be careful, the children with hugs and demands for stories upon his return. Finally, Kane turned to Ruth, who stood slightly apart, trying to maintain her composure. "Walk me to the gate?" he asked quietly. Ruth nodded, falling into step beside him as they moved away from the others. At the gate, Kane turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. 2 months, he said. "It'll pass quickly with the school keeping you busy." "I hope so," Ruth replied, trying to smile. "Be safe, Kane." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I have something for you. Not much, but I wanted you to have it." Ruth unwrapped the package carefully to find a small wooden carving of a horse, exquisitely detailed despite its small size. "Did you make this?" Kane nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "Been working on it in the evenings. Not as fine as something you could buy in a shop, but it's beautiful," Ruth interrupted sincerely. "I'll treasure it." Kane's expression softened. "I'll write as often as I can. Might be gaps when we're far from towns, but I'll send letters whenever possible." "I'll write too," Ruth promised. "The children can help me keep track of all the news to share with you." Kane glanced back at his family, who were trying to appear as though they weren't watching every moment of the farewell. With a small smile, he leaned down and kissed Ruth quickly but tenderly. "Until July," he said softly. "Until July," Ruth echoed. She stood at the gate long after Kane had ridden away, the small wooden horse clutched in her hand, until Rebecca gently called her in for breakfast. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that Ruth found surprisingly satisfying. The school flourished under her guidance, with more children joining as word spread of the quality of instruction available. Ruth found herself adapting her Boston teaching methods to the practical needs of farm children, incorporating lessons in agriculture and nature that would serve them in their daily lives. Rebecca proved to be both a wonderful hostess and a friend. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, the two women often sat on the porch talking long into the night. Ruth learned more about Kane through his sister's stories, his devotion to family, his quiet determination, his unwavering integrity even in difficult circumstances. "He's never brought a woman to meet me before," Rebecca confided one evening about a month after Kane's departure. "Never even mentioned the possibility." Ruth felt herself blush. "We've known each other such a short time." Rebecca smiled knowingly. "Time isn't always the best measure. My Robert and I knew within a week that we would marry. When it's right, it's right." Kane's letters arrived irregularly, as he'd warned, but each one was a treasure that Ruth read and reread in the privacy of her room. His handwriting was better than she'd expected, clear and even, though his spelling sometimes reflected his limited formal education. He wrote of the cattle drive, the men he worked with, the changing landscape as they moved north. But most meaningfully, he wrote of his thoughts of her, his plans for the future, his growing certainty that what had begun in that abandoned depot was meant to last. Ruth wrote back faithfully, sending her letters to the towns he'd mentioned along his route. She told him about the school, his nephews and niece, the small community that was gradually accepting her as one of their own. And as the weeks passed, she found herself writing more openly about her feelings for him, feelings that grew stronger rather than fading with distance and time. June brought the end of the school term, but as Kane had predicted, the parents requested that Ruth continue teaching through the summer, adjusted around the necessary farm work. Ruth gladly agreed, having found purpose and belonging in her new role. On the first day of July, Rebecca received a telegram that she handed to Ruth with barely concealed excitement. It was from Kane. Drive completed early. Arriving July 3rd. Letter follows. The letter arrived the next day, carried by a neighbor's son who had been to town. Kane explained that the cattle drive had reached its destination ahead of schedule, allowing him to return earlier than expected. He would arrive in time for James's birthday on the 4th, as promised. And he hopes you'll allow him to take you to the Independence Day celebration in town, Rebecca added, clearly having been entrusted with this part of the message. Ruth felt her cheeks warm. Of course I will. The day of Kane's expected arrival, Ruth found herself unable to concentrate on her lessons. The children were equally distracted, knowing their uncle would return with stories and small gifts, as he always did. By mid-afternoon, Ruth gave up on formal instruction and took the class outside for nature studies, which allowed her to keep an eye on the road while maintaining some pretense of educational activity. It was James who spotted the rider first, his keen eyes recognizing his uncle's silhouette against the horizon. "He's coming," he shouted, all teenage dignity forgotten in his excitement. Ruth's heart leapt as she followed his pointing finger. Even at a distance, she would know Kane's straight-backed riding posture anywhere. The children abandoned all pretense of studying and raced toward the approaching rider, with Ruth following at a more measured pace that belied her inner anticipation. Kane dismounted to greet the children, accepting their enthusiastic welcome with laughter and hugs. When he looked up and saw Ruth standing a few yards away, his smile broadened, crinkling the corners of his eyes in a way that made her heart beat faster. "Miss Harmon," he said, his voice warm as he approached her. "I hope I'm not interrupting your lessons." "We were just finishing for the day," Ruth replied, conscious of the children's curious gazes. "Welcome back, Mr. Thornton." Kane's eyes held hers, saying far more than was proper in front of 11 attentive students. "It's good to be back." That evening, after a celebratory dinner with Rebecca and the children, Kane asked Ruth to walk with him. They strolled toward the schoolhouse, their path now so familiar that they could have walked it blindfolded. "You look well," Kane said, studying her in the evening light. "Teaching agrees with you." "It does," Ruth agreed. "More than I expected." "These children are remarkable." "And my sister? She's not working you too hard." Ruth laughed. "Quite the opposite. She insists I'm family, not a boarder, and treats me accordingly." Kane nodded, seeming pleased. "And what about you, Ruth? Are you happy here?" They had reached the schoolhouse, and Ruth paused, turning to face him fully. "I am," she said honestly. "Happier than I've been in a very long time." Kane's expression softened. "I've thought about you every day," he said quietly. "Every mile of the trail. Every night under the stars." "I've thought of you too," Ruth admitted. "Your letters meant so much to me." Kane took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "Before I left, I said I wanted to court you properly when I returned. Do you still welcome that?" Ruth's heart felt full to bursting. "Yes," she said simply. "Very much so." The smile that spread across Kane's face was worth every day of waiting. He drew her closer, one hand moving to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Ruth Harmon?" "Please," she whispered. His lips met hers with restrained passion, communicating months of longing in a kiss that remained respectful but left no doubt about the depth of his feelings. Ruth responded in kind, her hands resting on his chest, feeling his heart beat strongly beneath her palm. When they finally parted, Kane kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I've been dreaming of doing that for 2 months," he confessed. "Was it worth the wait?" Ruth asked, a teasing note in her voice. Kane's low chuckle vibrated through her. More than worth it, he assured her. Though I wouldn't object to less waiting in the future. Ruth smiled, feeling happier than she had thought possible when she'd sat alone in that abandoned depot months ago. Neither would I. The Independence Day celebration in Lawrence proved to be a grand affair, with bunting decorating the main street, speeches from local dignitaries, a parade, and to the children's delight, ice cream and fireworks. Kane and Ruth attended with Rebecca and the children, but managed to find moments alone amid the festivities. I have something to show you, Kane said as the afternoon progressed. If you can spare an hour? Ruth nodded, curious, and Kane led her to where his horse was hitched outside the general store. It's a short ride, he explained, helping her mount before swinging up behind her. They rode out of town on a well-maintained road that followed the river for several miles before turning onto a smaller track that led up a gentle hill. As they crested the rise, Ruth gasped at the view: rolling meadows interspersed with stands of trees, a creek winding through the valley below, and in the distance, the spire of the Lawrence Church visible against the horizon. It's beautiful, she said sincerely. Kane reined in the horse, allowing Ruth to take in the scene. This is the land I mentioned, he said quietly. The place I've been saving for. Ruth turned slightly to look at him over her shoulder. Your ranch? Kane nodded. 160 acres. Good water year-round from the creek. Enough flat land for hay, plenty of grazing, and that grove of trees for building. He paused, then added, I made an offer before I left for the cattle drive. Got word yesterday that it was accepted. Kane, that's wonderful, Ruth exclaimed, genuinely happy for him. When will you start building? That depends, he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Ruth, I need to ask you something important. He guided the horse to a particularly beautiful spot overlooking the valley and dismounted, helping Ruth down to stand beside him. Taking both her hands in his, Kane looked into her eyes with an expression of such earnest hope that Ruth's breath caught. These past months have shown me what I want for my future: this land, horses to raise, a home to build. He paused, his thumbs gently stroking the backs of her hands. But none of it means anything without you to share it with. Ruth's heart began to race as Kane continued. I know it hasn't been long since we met. Some might say it's too soon. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. He took a deep breath. Ruth Harmon, will you marry me? Will you build this dream with me? Tears of joy filled Ruth's eyes as she looked at this man who had changed her life so completely in such a short time. The man who had sat beside her when she was alone and stayed when she needed someone most. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain despite her tears. Yes, Kane Thornton, I will marry you. Kane's face lit with a joy that matched her own. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance before setting her down gently and kissing her with a tenderness that belied his strength. I don't have a proper ring yet, he apologized when they finally parted. The cattle drive paid well, but I put most of it toward the land. I don't need a ring, Ruth assured him, cradling his face in her hands. Just you, and this beautiful place we'll call home. They stayed on the hilltop for some time, Kane pointing out his plans for the property where the house would stand, the barn, the corrals for the horses he would breed and train. Ruth added her own suggestions, already envisioning their life together on this land. As the sun began to lower in the sky, they reluctantly mounted the horse to return to town for the evening fireworks. Kane held Ruth securely against him as they rode, occasionally pressing a kiss to her hair or cheek, as if to reassure himself that she was real and had truly accepted his proposal. When they rejoined Rebecca and the children for the fireworks display, Kane's sister took one look at their radiant faces and knew immediately what had transpired. It's about time, she said, hugging them both with tears in her eyes. I knew from Kane's first letter about you that something important had happened. The children were equally excited, especially when Kane explained that the new ranch would be close enough for frequent visits. As fireworks exploded overhead in celebration of the nation's independence, Ruth felt they were also celebrating the beginning of her new life, one far different from what she had planned, but infinitely more precious for being unexpected. The weeks that followed were filled with preparations. Kane divided his time between working on the ranch property, clearing land, cutting timber for the house and barn, and helping with the harvest on Rebecca's farm. Ruth continued teaching, but also began learning the practical skills of ranch life from Rebecca, determined to be a true partner to Kane in their new venture. They decided on a September wedding, to be held in the small church in Lawrence with Rebecca's family and their growing circle of friends in attendance. Ruth wrote to her cousin in New York, sharing her unexpected happiness and inviting her to the ceremony. In early September, just 2 weeks before the wedding, Ruth stood on the site of their future home, watching as Kane and several neighbors raised the frame of the small house they would share. The men worked with practiced efficiency, the structure taking shape before her eyes. "What do you think?" Kane asked during a break, coming to stand beside her. "It's not fancy, but it'll be solid and warm for winter." Ruth slipped her hand into his, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "Everything I could want." Kane's expression grew serious as he looked from the half-built house to her face. "Are you sure, Ruth? This life. It's not what you planned. Not what you would have had in California or back in Boston." Ruth considered his question carefully, wanting her answer to reflect her true feelings rather than merely what he wanted to hear. "When I left Boston," she said slowly, "I thought I knew exactly what my future held. Benjamin's letters had painted such a clear picture that I could almost see myself there, in the life he described." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But looking back, I realized that picture never quite felt real to me. It was like a beautiful illustration in a book, something to admire, but not something I could step into." Ruth turned to face Kane fully. "This," she said, gesturing to the land around them, the half-built house, and finally placing her hand on his chest, "this feels real. It feels like where I'm meant to be, with the person I'm meant to be with." Kane covered her hand with his own, his eyes reflecting emotions too deep for words. "I'll spend my life making sure you never regret that choice," he promised. "I know you will," Ruth replied softly. "Just as I'll spend mine making sure you never regret that night you walked into an abandoned depot and decided to stay." Their wedding day dawned clear and mild, a perfect September morning. The small church in Lawrence was decorated with wildflowers and ribbons, thanks to Rebecca and the ladies of the town. Ruth wore a simple gown of ivory satin that Rebecca had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had once adorned her mother's wedding dress. Kane waited at the altar in a new suit, his usual cowboy attire replaced for this one day, with more formal clothing that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. When Ruth appeared at the church door on James's arm, the boy having proudly accepted the honor of giving his teacher away, Kane's face transformed with a joy so pure that Ruth felt tears spring to her eyes. The ceremony was brief, but deeply meaningful. They exchanged simple vows and rings. Kane had insisted on proper gold bands, purchased with the proceeds from the sale of 2 horses he'd trained. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Kane's kiss was both tender and promising, drawing good-natured cheers from their friends and neighbors. The celebration afterward was held at Rebecca's farm, with tables set up in the yard and enough food to feed half the county. There was music and dancing, children playing games, and as evening fell, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the gathering. "Mrs. Thornton," Kane said as they shared a dance, the name still new and wonderful to both of them. "Are you happy?" Ruth looked up at her husband, this man who had changed her life so completely in the span of a few months. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she said truthfully. "And you, Mr. Thornton?" Kane's smile was all the answer she needed, but he added words as well. I thought I knew what I wanted: land, horses, a place of my own. But it turns out what I really needed was you. As the celebration continued around them, Ruth thought back to that fateful day in the abandoned depot. She had been at her lowest point, facing an uncertain future alone. And then Kane had walked in, taken the seat beside her, and stayed. What had seemed like the end of her dreams had actually been the beginning of something far better, a love born in an unexpected moment that would last a lifetime. 5 years later, Ruth stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as Kane taught their 3-year-old son to sit on a gentle mare in the corral. Their daughter, not quite a year old, rested on Ruth's hip, her small hand tangled in her mother's hair. The ranch had flourished under their joint care. Kane's reputation as a horse trainer had spread throughout the region, bringing a steady income and the satisfaction of work he loved. Ruth had continued teaching, first in the small schoolhouse near Rebecca's farm and now in a purpose-built school on their own property that served children from several neighboring ranches. Their home had grown too, with additions to the original small structure as their family expanded. It was still modest by some standards, but filled with love and laughter and all the things that truly mattered. Rebecca and her children visited often, the families remaining close despite the few miles that separated them. James, now 20, worked alongside Kane in the horse business, showing a natural talent that his uncle nurtured with pride. As Ruth watched her husband lift their son from the horse with gentle hands, praising the boy's bravery, she felt the familiar wave of gratitude that had become part of her daily life. How different things might have been if she had continued to California or returned east in her grief. How much she would have missed. Kane looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still as warm and genuine as the day they'd met, sent a flutter through her heart even after years of marriage. He whispered something to their son, who ran toward the house calling, "Mama." "I rode all by myself." Ruth set their daughter down on the porch, safely contained by the railing, and knelt to receive her son's enthusiastic embrace. "I saw. You were very brave, Kenneth." Kane joined them, scooping up their daughter Rose, who squealed in delight at her father's attention. "I was thinking," he said casually as they all settled on the porch swing, "that we might ride into Lawrence tomorrow for the Harvest Festival." "All of us?" Ruth asked, knowing how busy Kane was with the 3 horses he was currently training for a rancher in Colorado. "All of us," Kane confirmed. "Family time's important. The horses can wait a day." Ruth leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked softly. "That day in the depot?" Kane's arm tightened around her. "Every day," he said honestly. "Best decision I ever made, sitting down beside a crying woman in an abandoned train station. And staying," Ruth added with a smile. "And staying," Kane agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Always staying." As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in brilliant golds and pinks, Ruth thought about the strange and wonderful paths that life could take. How sorrow could lead to joy, how endings could become beginnings, and how sometimes the greatest love stories started in the most unexpected places, like an abandoned depot where a cowboy took the seat beside her and stayed.